A loyal German shepherd stood rigid beside a flag-draped coffin, his desperate barks echoing through the small-town funeral home as 7-year-old Lily Morgan clutched his collar, tears streaming down her face. When the director tried to calm a frantic animal, no one could have predicted what would happen next. The dog's relentless behavior led to a discovery that would not only change the Morgan family forever, but shake an entire military community to its core. What they found inside that coffin will leave you speechless. If you're ready for a story that will challenge everything you thought you knew about loyalty, intuition, and the bonds that connect us beyond understanding, keep watching and let us know in the comments where you're viewing from. Before we continue this extraordinary story, tell us where you're watching from. And if this touches your heart like it did mine, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly remarkable that you won't want to miss. Major Thomas Morgan checked his watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The October afternoon had settled over Pinewood earlier than expected, darkness descending like a heavy curtain across the small military town. Rain tapped insistently against the kitchen window as he read through the official notification again, the words no longer registering as his mind struggled to accept their meaning. "Daddy, can Rex and I go outside?" Lily's voice broke through his thoughts, her small figure appearing in the doorway with the German shepherd attentive at her side. At 7 years old, Lily had her mother's eyes, deep brown with flecks of amber that seemed to catch the light even on the darkest days. Rex, the retired military working dog who had been Thomas's companion through 2 tours in Afghanistan, had become Lily's inseparable shadow since her mother's passing 2 years ago. "Not now, sweetie." "The weather's turning bad," Thomas replied, quickly folding the letter and slipping it into his pocket. "Why don't you both help me make dinner instead?" Lily nodded, though her disappointed gaze drifted toward the window where raindrops raced each other down the glass. Rex, sensing the shift in the room's energy, moved closer to Thomas, his intelligent eyes studying his master's face with uncanny perception. At 8 years old, Rex had been Thomas's partner during his time with the military police K9 unit, with more successful missions than any other dog in the battalion's history. Upon retirement, Rex had transitioned from military working dog to family companion, a role he had embraced with the same dedication he'd shown in service. Thomas ran his hand absently over Rex's head, the familiar texture of his fur grounding him as his thoughts threatened to spiral. How could he possibly explain to Lily that her Uncle Jake, his younger brother, her favorite uncle, and Rex's former handler during his final deployment, wasn't coming home as planned? Captain Jacob Morgan, decorated Special Forces operative, had been reported killed in action during a classified operation 2 weeks ago. His body was being returned to Pinewood for burial with full military honors. The funeral was scheduled for tomorrow, and Thomas still hadn't found the words to tell his daughter. Rex whined softly, pressing against Thomas's leg as if sensing his internal struggle. The German shepherd had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect shifts in Thomas's emotional state, a skill that had saved lives in combat zones and provided comfort in the quiet battles fought at home. "He knows something's wrong," Lily said simply, her observation carrying the uncomplicated wisdom of childhood. "You're sad, and Rex can tell." Thomas managed a small smile, constantly amazed by his daughter's perceptiveness. "You're right, kiddo. I do have something sad to tell you." He led Lily to the living room couch, Rex following dutifully behind. As they sat together, the German shepherd positioned himself at Lily's feet, his vigilant gaze moving between father and daughter. "You know, Uncle Jake was supposed to come home next week," Thomas began carefully. Lily nodded enthusiastically. "He promised to teach me how to fish, and he said he had a special present for me from where he was working." Thomas felt his throat Titan, sweetheart Uncle Jake. He was very brave, doing very important work, but sometimes even when people are brave and do everything right, bad things can still happen. Understanding dawned slowly in Lily's eyes, her small features crumpling as she processed what her father wasn't explicitly saying. "Is Uncle Jake with Mommy now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas nodded, unable to speak as he pulled his daughter into his arms. Rex, responding to Lily's distress, moved closer, resting his head on her lap. The three of them remained there as the afternoon rain intensified, the steady drumming on the roof a somber accompaniment to their grief. Later that evening, after Lily had finally fallen asleep, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with Colonel Richard, Hayes, his former commanding officer and Jake's last supervisor. "The official story stands," Hayes said quietly, his weathered face grave in the dim kitchen light. "Killed in action during a routine security operation. The Medal of Honor recommendation is already being processed." Thomas stared into his cooling coffee. "And the actual story?" Hayes's silence spoke volumes. After 20 years of military service, Thomas understood the weight of classified information. Some details would never be shared, even with family. "What I can tell you," Hayes finally offered, "is that your brother saved his entire team. What happened out there?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. It wasn't routine, and Jake's actions were nothing short of extraordinary. Did he suffer? The question escaped before Thomas could stop it, the part of him that was a brother temporarily overriding the soldier who knew better than to ask. "It was quick," Hayes answered, the slight hesitation barely perceptible. "The medical examiner confirmed that?" Thomas nodded, accepting the comfort offered, even if he suspected it might be a merciful lie. "The casket arrives tomorrow morning," Hayes continued. "Closed casket ceremony, as discussed. The damage was extensive." Thomas understood the implication. Whatever had happened to Jake, his injuries made an open casket inadvisable. A common enough occurrence in military deaths, but the knowledge did nothing to ease the hollow feeling, expanding in his chest. "I appreciate you handling the arrangements," Thomas said, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "With Sarah gone, it's just been hard to—" "You don't need to explain," Hayes interrupted gently. "Jake was one of our finest. We take care of our own." After Hayes left, Thomas found himself drawn to the backyard, despite the continuing rain. Rex followed silently, staying close as Thomas stared into the darkness. The German shepherd had known Jake well, had even served with him briefly during a joint operation in their overlapping military careers. "He's really gone, buddy," Thomas whispered, his words nearly lost in the rainfall. Rex's ears perked forward, his head tilting slightly, as if considering this information. Then, unexpectedly, he let out a low, mournful sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a howl, but something ancient and primal that seemed to express grief in its purest form. The morning of the funeral dawned with an unseasonable chill, the October sky clear and pale as if washed clean by the previous night's rain. Thomas helped Lily into the simple black dress they'd purchased for the occasion, his heart breaking as she carefully attached a small pin to the collar, a silver K9 badge that Jake had given her on his last visit home. Uncle Jake said, "I'm an honorary dog handler," she explained solemnly, "because Rex listens to me sometimes." "He sure does," Thomas agreed, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Rex has always had a soft spot for you." Speaking of the German shepherd, Thomas realized he hadn't seen him since breakfast. "Where's Rex hiding?" Lily pointed toward her bedroom. "He's under my bed. He doesn't want to come out." Thomas frowned. Rex had never shown anxiety about leaving the house before. In fact, the well-trained former military dog typically maintained the same disciplined readiness he'd displayed in service. "Rex, come," Thomas called, using the formal command tone that the dog had been trained to respond to without hesitation. Nothing. Concerned now, Thomas went to Lily's room and knelt beside the bed. In the shadowy space beneath, he could make out Rex's form, the German shepherd curled tightly against the wall, eyes alert but refusing to move. "What's going on, buddy?" Thomas asked softly, reaching toward him. Rex whined, a sound so distressed that Thomas immediately withdrew his hand. In 8 years together, through combat zones and civilian life, he had never seen the dog behave this way. "Is he sick?" Lily asked, appearing in the doorway. "I don't think so," Thomas replied, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "Maybe he's just sensing that we're sad today." After several more failed attempts to coax Rex out, Thomas made a difficult decision. They would have to leave him home during the funeral. He made sure the dog had water and access to the backyard through his dog door, then reluctantly left. With Lily for the funeral home, the Pinewood Memorial Chapel was filled beyond capacity, a testament to Jake's popularity in the close-knit military community. The flag-draped casket stood at the front, surrounded by floral arrangements and a large portrait of Jake in his dress uniform. Thomas felt Lily's small hand tighten around his as they took their places in the front row. The ceremony proceeded with military precision, the honor guard standing at attention, the chaplain speaking of sacrifice and duty, former comrades sharing carefully selected memories that celebrated Jake's life while navigating around the classified circumstances of his death. Throughout it all, Thomas maintained his composure, even as he felt the absence of Rex beside them, the loyal companion who had helped them both navigate their grief after Sarah's death. As the service concluded and attendees began offering personal condolences, the chapel doors unexpectedly burst open. A collective gasp rose from the gathering as Rex bounded down the center aisle, his powerful body moving with determined purpose. Thomas stood immediately, embarrassment and confusion washing over him. "Rex, heel!" he commanded sharply. For the first time in their long partnership, Rex completely ignored the command. Instead, the German shepherd raced directly to the casket, circling it before positioning himself beside it, barking with an urgency that Thomas had only heard in combat situations, the specific alert that Rex had been trained to give when detecting explosives or potential threats. "I'm so sorry," Thomas apologized to the startled funeral director, moving quickly to retrieve his dog. "He's never done anything like this." As Thomas reached for Rex's collar, Lily slipped from her seat and ran to the German shepherd's side. "He's trying to tell us something, Daddy," she insisted, wrapping her arms around Rex's neck as he continued to bark at the casket. The funeral director approached cautiously. "Sir, perhaps we should move your dog outside. This is highly irregular." Colonel Hayes had joined them now, his expression a mixture of concern and something else, a subtle alertness that Thomas recognized from their days in the field. "The dog served with Jake, didn't he?" Hayes asked quietly. Thomas nodded, still struggling to control Rex, who had begun scratching at the side of the casket, his barks growing more frantic. "Daddy," Rex says. "Uncle Jake is in trouble," Lily said, with absolute conviction, her eyes wide and serious. "Sweetheart, Uncle Jake is—" Thomas couldn't finish the sentence, not with his daughter looking at him with such certainty. Hayes was studying Rex intently now, watching the trained alerts the dog was giving. "These are the same signals he would give for—" The colonel didn't complete his thought, but a silent communication passed between the two military men. Without further discussion, Hayes turned to the funeral director. "I think we need to examine the casket. Sir, I can't possibly. This is highly inappropriate and against protocol," the director protested, looking horrified at the suggestion. "Override protocol," Hayes replied, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. "National security consideration." The funeral home fell silent as attendees watched the unexpected drama unfold. Thomas lifted Lily into his arms, moving her slightly away as Hayes and two other military personnel approached the casket. "Sir, even if I wanted to comply, the casket is sealed for a reason," the director continued desperately. "The family was advised that due to the nature of Captain Morgan's injuries—" "Open it," Hayes ordered, his tone leaving no room for further discussion. "Now!" The director looked to Thomas, silently pleading for intervention. But Thomas, who had spent years trusting Rex's instincts in life-or-death situations, found himself nodding his agreement. Whatever was happening, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: Rex wouldn't behave this way without reason. The next few minutes unfolded in tense silence as the funeral director reluctantly produced the necessary tools to unseal the casket. Rex had grown quieter but remained vigilant, his attention fixed unwavering on the coffin, muscles tensed as if ready to spring into action. As the director prepared to lift the lid, Hayes motioned for most of the attendees to step back, creating space around the casket. Thomas handed Lily to a trusted family friend, instructing them to take her to the anteroom. This was not something his daughter needed to witness, regardless of what they found. The casket lid rose slowly, the funeral director's hands visibly trembling as he completed the task. The collective breath of everyone remaining in the room seemed to hold as the contents were revealed. Hayes was the first to react, his face draining of color as he looked inside. "My God," he whispered, an exclamation that seemed torn from him involuntarily. Thomas stepped forward, uncertain what horror he was about to face. His brother's body, perhaps more badly damaged than they had prepared him for. What he saw instead caused him to stagger backward in shock. The casket contained no body at all. Instead, it held approximately 80 pounds of sandbags arranged in a human shape, along with various weights to mimic the expected heft of a corpse. Most chilling of all, positioned where the head should have been, was a sophisticated electronic device with a small blinking light, technology Thomas immediately recognized as military-grade. Rex had stopped barking entirely now, watching the humans process the discovery he had been trying to alert them to all along. The German Shepherd's training had allowed him to detect what no one else could, that the casket supposedly containing his former handler held something entirely different. Hayes was already on his phone, speaking in rapid, hushed tones, using code words that Thomas hadn't heard since his active duty days. Around them, confusion and speculation spread through the remaining attendees like wildfire. "Thomas," Hayes said, covering the phone's mouthpiece, "we need to clear the chapel. Now." Thomas nodded, still struggling to process what he was seeing. If Jake wasn't in the casket, then where was he? Was there any possibility, however remote, that his brother might still be alive? As if reading his thoughts, Hayes added in a voice only Thomas could hear, "This changes everything. The device, it's one of ours, used for deep cover operations. We need to initiate Protocol Echo immediately." Protocol Echo. Thomas felt his military training kick in, overriding his personal shock. Echo was only activated when an operative presumed dead might potentially be alive, but in extreme danger, typically in deep cover situations where their survival depended on the world believing they had been killed. As the chapel cleared under Hayes's orders, Thomas found himself standing alone. Beside the open casket, Rex now calmly sitting at his feet. The German Shepherd looked up at him, as if to say his job was done. He had detected the deception, alerted his humans, and now trusted them to take appropriate action. Thomas knelt beside Rex, burying his face in the dog's fur as the full implications washed over him. "You knew," he whispered. "Somehow you knew he wasn't in there." Rex whined softly, pressing against Thomas in a gesture of comfort that transcended the boundaries between human and canine communication. In that moment, as rain began to patter once more against the chapel windows, Thomas found himself caught between impossible hope and devastating new uncertainty. His brother might be alive, But if so, he was somewhere far away, in danger so severe that an elaborate deception had been constructed to protect him, and somehow a German shepherd with an extraordinary sense of loyalty had detected what an entire military establishment had missed, setting in motion events that would ultimately reshape not just the Morgan family, but potentially national security itself. As Thomas rose to join Hayes and the rapidly assembling crisis team, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. The story of Jake Morgan and the remarkable dog who refused to accept his death was just beginning. Colonel Hayes ushered Thomas into an unmarked black SUV waiting outside the chapel, his expression a carefully controlled mask of professional concern. "We're heading to Fort Campbell. Command center is being established as we speak." Thomas glanced. Back at the chapel, where military personnel were securing the scene, keeping onlookers at bay. "Lily, Major Dawson is taking her and Rex to your sister's place in Nashville," Hayes assured him. "They'll be safe there while we sort this out." Thomas had barely registered Lily's tearful protests as she was led away, Rex padding protectively at her side. The German shepherd had performed his duty, alerting them to the deception, and now seemed content to remain with the child he had appointed himself guardian of. "Richard," Thomas said once they were alone in the vehicle, using the colonel's first name for the first time in years. "What the hell is going on? Why would anyone fake Jake's death? And that device in the casket?" Hayes held up a hand. "Compartmentalized information only from this point. I can't brief you fully until we're at Fort Campbell and you've been officially brought into the operation." "Operation," Thomas repeated incredulously. "My brother's funeral just turned into a scene from a spy thriller, and you're telling me to wait for a briefing?" Hayes's expression softened momentarily. "I understand this is personal for you, Thomas, but Jake's situation is—" He paused, searching for words. "Complicated in ways that extend beyond family considerations." The remainder of the hour-long drive passed in tense silence, Thomas's mind racing through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Jake had been assigned to Special Activities Division for his last deployment, the most covert operations. The military conducted, often in cooperation with intelligence agencies. Whatever he'd been involved in was clearly beyond the standard classified missions Thomas had experience with during his own service. Fort Campbell's security was operating at heightened alert when they arrived, the checkpoint guards more numerous and heavily armed than usual. Hayes's credentials ushered them through without delay to a section of the base Thomas had never accessed before. A nondescript building with no external markings besides a simple numerical designation. Inside, the bland exterior gave way to a sophisticated command center, humming with activity. Large screens displayed maps, data streams, and surveillance footage from what appeared to be multiple international locations. Military personnel worked alongside civilians in suits who Thomas immediately recognized as intelligence operatives, though which agency remained unclear. A woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked black hair tied in a severe bun, approached them immediately. "Colonel Hayes, Secure Room 3 is ready." Her eyes flicked to Thomas. "This is the brother, Major Thomas Morgan," Hayes confirmed. "Served with distinction in MPK-9 units, 2 tours in Afghanistan, top-level clearance during active duty." "The Casticere," woman nodded. "I'm Deputy Director Landry. Follow me, gentlemen." She led them through a series of security checkpoints to a windowless conference room where 3 people were already waiting. A young man in civilian clothes with the unmistakable bearing of military special forces, an older man in an impeccable suit, and, to Thomas's surprise, Dr. Elaine Winters, the veterinarian who had treated Rex throughout his military service and subsequent retirement. "What's Elaine doing here?" Thomas asked as they entered. Hayes ignored the question, gesturing for Thomas to take a seat. Once the door was secured, Deputy Director Landry activated a jamming device and nodded to Hayes. "Major Morgan," Hayes began, Formally, what I'm about to share is classified at the highest level. Disclosure to unauthorized personnel is a federal offense carrying penalties of up to life imprisonment. Do you understand? The ritualistic security warning felt surreal under the circumstances, but Thomas nodded. I understand. 3 weeks ago, Hayes continued, Captain Jacob Morgan was embedded with a specialized team investigating reports of a new bioweapon being developed in a non-sanctioned facility near the Kazakhstan-Russia border. Thomas's stomach tightened. Jake had told him he was deployed to Eastern Europe on a training mission. The operation was officially classified as reconnaissance only, but carried contingency authorization for sample acquisition if the intelligence proved accurate. Hayes's voice remained clinically detached. Captain Morgan's team confirmed the facility existed and was indeed developing an advanced bioagent. During sample collection, the team was compromised. The young man in civilian clothes spoke up. 2 team members were killed in the extraction. Captain Morgan secured the samples but sustained injuries during escape. What kind of injuries? Thomas demanded. Hayes and Landry exchanged glances before the colonel continued. According to protocol, the bio-samples were transported in specialized containment devices. During the firefight, one of these containers was damaged. Captain Morgan was exposed. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. He's infected with an unknown bioweapon. Yes and no. Dr. Winters spoke for the first time, her familiar voice startlingly out of place in this sterile environment. The agent is designed to remain dormant in the host until activated by a specific external stimulus. It's unlike anything we've seen before. Thomas looked between the grim faces surrounding him. But he's alive. Yes, Hayes confirmed. Currently, in a secure medical facility under quarantine. His death was fabricated to prevent hostile actors from learning that we had obtained samples and had a living host for study. Study, Thomas repeated, a new horror dawning. My brother is being treated as a lab specimen? He's being treated as a patient, Dr. Winters corrected firmly, but also as the key to understanding a potentially catastrophic biological threat. The man in the suit, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. Major Morgan, I'm Edward. Chambers, Defense Intelligence Agency. Your brother volunteered for this protocol when exposure was confirmed. He understood that if the enemy discovered he was alive and infected, they would stop at nothing to either eliminate him or recapture him for their own research. Thomas struggled to process this information. So the empty casket, the fake funeral, it was all to convince potential hostiles that Jake died and any samples were lost? Precisely, Landry confirmed, a standard deception protocol for situations of this nature. Then, explain to me, Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. How? My retired military working dog knew something was wrong. If this deception was so perfect, why did Rex alert on that casket? The room fell silent. Finally, Dr. Winters spoke. That's precisely why I'm here, Thomas. When Colonel Hayes reported what happened, I insisted on joining this briefing. She opened a folder on the table. Rex served with both you and Jake at different points in his career, correct? Thomas nodded. He was my partner for 5 years. When I rotated to training duties, Jake requested Rex for his team. They worked together for about 8 months before Rex took shrapnel in his hind leg and was retired. During that time, Dr. Winters continued, Rex would have become acutely attuned to Jake's specific biological signature, his scent profile, if you will. Of course, Thomas agreed. That's basic canine training. The dog bonds with his handler, learns to track them even in contaminated environments. What's less understood, Dr. Winters explained, is how deeply that sensory imprinting goes. Recent research suggests military working dogs don't just memorize a scent. They develop a complex neurological map of their handlers that includes subtle biological markers we can't even detect with our best equipment. The young Special Forces operative frowned. Are you suggesting the dog somehow knew Captain Morgan wasn't in that casket because he couldn't smell him? More than that, Dr. Winters replied. I believe Rex detected something that contradicted his neurological mapping of Jake. Not just the absence of Jake, but the presence of something that actively registered as wrong. The bioagent, Thomas realized, pieces suddenly falling into place. Rex was alerting on traces of the bioagent in the casket. Dr. Winters nodded. The electronic device in the casket contained a microscopic sample of the neutralized agent, placed there deliberately to convince any sophisticated detection equipment that biological remains were present, degraded by the neutralizing agent, as would be expected in a properly processed military casualty. Standard protocol for high-security situations involving biological elements, Chambers confirmed. Essentially a red herring for any hostile actors who might attempt to verify the death. Thomas felt a chill run through him. You're telling me my brother is infected with something so dangerous you had to create elaborate false evidence, yet some trace of it was considered safe enough to place in a casket at a public funeral? The sample was completely neutralized, Hayes assured him, harmless but molecularly convincing to any analysis. The risk was calculated and minimal. Tell that to Rex, Thomas countered. He detected it immediately and recognized it as a threat. Landry leaned forward, sudden interest sharpening her features. Dr. Winters, is it possible the dog could detect the difference between active and neutralized forms of the bioagent? Theoretically, yes, Dr. Winters replied. Military working dogs like Rex are trained to alert differently based on the state of explosives, whether they're stable or volatile, for instance. His behavior at the funeral suggests he recognized something similar to Jake, but fundamentally wrong, something that registered as a threat. Thomas recalled Rex's behavior, the frantic barking, the desperate attempts to alert them. Not grief, but alarm, warning. I want to see my brother, Thomas said firmly. The atmosphere in the room shifted, tension crackling like static electricity. That's not possible at this stage, Chambers replied smoothly. The quarantine protocols. Let me be clear, Thomas interrupted, his voice taking on the command tone he'd used in combat situations. I am not asking permission. I'm telling you what's going to happen next. Either I see Jake within the next 24 hours, or I will assume this entire operation is something other than what you're claiming. Hayes studied him for a long moment before turning to Landry. Thomas has unique value in this situation. His military experience, his relationship to Jake, and most importantly, his connection to the dog that somehow detected what our best technology missed. The dog, Thomas corrected quietly. Rex has a name, and if he detected something in that casket that your equipment couldn't, maybe he can help with whatever you're trying to learn from my brother. Dr. Winters nodded slowly. He's right. From a scientific perspective, Rex's sensory capabilities might provide insights we can't get from conventional analysis. Landry's expression remained skeptical. You're suggesting we bring a dog into a level 4 biocontainment facility. I'm suggesting, Dr. Winters replied with professional confidence, that this particular dog has already demonstrated unique detection capabilities related to this specific bioagent. Ignoring that potential resource would be scientifically irresponsible. A heavy silence fell over the room as Landry and Chambers appeared to communicate silently, weighing options and implications. Finally, Landry nodded curtly. 24 hours to arrange secure transport and modified quarantine protocols. Major, Morgan and the dog will be granted limited access under strict supervision. Her eyes fixed on Thomas with steely intensity. But understand this, if at any point your presence compromises the security of this operation or the safety protocols surrounding your brother, you will be removed immediately. Is that clear?" "Perfectly," Thomas replied, relief washing through him despite the ominous circumstances. He was going to see Jake, confirmation that his brother was truly alive, not just an abstract concept discussed in a sterile briefing room. As the meeting adjourned and arrangements were set in motion, Thomas pulled Dr. Winters aside. "Elaine, level with me. What are Jake's chances?" The veterinarian's professional composure softened slightly. "I don't know, Thomas. I've only seen the preliminary data. The bioagent is unlike anything in our existing catalogues. It seems designed to integrate with human cellular structures rather than simply damage them. Jake isn't exactly sick in the conventional sense. He's changing." "Changing how?" Thomas pressed, a new dread forming in the pit of his stomach. "That's what they're trying to determine," she replied carefully. "The process appears to be progressive, but controllable under current protocols. Beyond that, I can't say." As Thomas followed Hayes back through the labyrinthine facility, his thoughts turned to Lily and Rex, now presumably arriving at his sister Catherine's home in Nashville. How much should Lily know? How could he explain any of this to a 7-year-old who had already lost her mother and now faced the confusing reality that her supposedly dead uncle might be alive, but fundamentally altered by an enemy bioweapon? And Rex, the loyal companion whose extraordinary senses had detected what human technology missed. What role would he play in whatever came next? The German Shepherd had already dramatically altered the course of events once. Thomas suspected his partner's contribution to this unfolding crisis was far from over. "We'll arrange secure transport to the facility tomorrow morning," Hayes informed him as they reached the building's exit. "You'll be escorted to retrieve the dog, then proceed directly to the secure location." "Does Jake know I'm coming?" Thomas asked. Hayes's expression revealed nothing. Captain Morgan's current condition includes periods of diminished awareness. "He'll be informed when medical staff deem it appropriate." The ominous phrasing sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Thomas. What had his brother become? What would he find when he finally saw Jake face to face? As they stepped outside into the fading October afternoon, Thomas looked up at the gathering clouds, heavy with the promise of more rain. Somewhere beyond those clouds, beyond the comfortable boundaries of normal life, his brother was fighting a battle unlike any they had trained for, against an enemy that had already breached his defenses and was now waging war from within. And Thomas, who had spent his military career handling a dog trained to detect threats, now faced the supreme irony that Rex, retired, relaxing into civilian life, had detected the most significant threat of all. One that might have global implications beyond anything they could imagine. The rain began to fall as Thomas climbed into the vehicle that would take him to his sister's home in Nashville, to Lily and Rex, to the next phase of an operation that had begun with a dog barking at an empty coffin and now stretched into terrifying, unknown territory. Whatever they would find tomorrow at the secure facility, Thomas was certain of one thing: nothing would ever be the same again. Catherine Morgan Winter's sprawling Nashville home sat nestled among ancient oak trees at the end of a private drive, its colonial architecture and manicured grounds projecting a sense of stability that felt jarringly at odds with the chaos of the past 24 hours. Thomas arrived just after sunset, the security detail Hayes had assigned maintaining a discreet perimeter around the property. His sister met him at the door, her usual composed demeanor fractured by concern and confusion. At 43, Catherine was 5 years his senior and had always projected an air of unflappable confidence, a trait that had served her well as one of Tennessee's most successful corporate attorneys. "Thomas," she said, pulling him into a tight embrace, "what in God's name is happening? We were told Jake was dead. Then Lily arrives with a military escort babbling about Rex finding something in the coffin, and now there are men watching my house." "It's complicated, Kate," Thomas replied, his voice low. "Where's Lily?" "Upstairs with Rex. That dog hasn't left her side since they arrived." Catherine led him into her spacious kitchen, away from the ears of the security personnel. Major Dawson refused to tell me anything, except that it was a developing security situation. "Thomas, I deserve to know what's going on." "Jake was my brother too." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion and stress etching lines in his face. "Jake isn't dead." Catherine froze, her hand gripping the counter. "What?" "The funeral, the casket, it was all staged. He's alive, but—" Thomas struggled to find words that would satisfy his sister's questions without violating the confidentiality agreements he'd signed hours earlier. "He's in a secure medical facility. That's all I can tell you right now." "That's all you can tell me?" Catherine's voice rose incrementally, the attorney in her emerging. "My brother's death was faked at a public funeral. My niece is traumatized. My home is under surveillance, and that's all you can tell me." "Kate, please," Thomas implored. "This goes beyond family. There are national security implications I'm not authorized to discuss." Something in his expression must have conveyed the gravity of the situation, because Catherine's professional instincts took over. She nodded curtly, compartmentalizing her personal reactions the way she would approach a complex legal case. "All right, what do you need from me?" "I need to take Rex tomorrow. Lily will stay here with you where it's safe." "Take Rex where?" Thomas shook his head. "I can't say." Catherine studied him, connecting invisible dots. "This has something to do with what the dog found in that casket, doesn't it?" Thomas maintained his silence, which was answer enough. "Daddy!" Lily's voice broke the tension as she appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing the black dress from the funeral, though someone had added a purple sweater, her favorite color. Rex padded silently beside her, his alert eyes immediately finding Thomas and assessing his emotional state. Thomas knelt, opening his arms as Lily ran to him. "Hey, sweetheart," he murmured into her hair as he held her close. "Are you okay?" Lily pulled back, her expression unnervingly serious for a 7-year-old. "Rex was right, wasn't he? Uncle Jake isn't in heaven." Thomas and Catherine exchanged glances. "Why do you say that, Lily?" Thomas asked carefully. "Because Rex would have been sad if Uncle Jake was really gone." "But he wasn't sad. He was trying to tell us something was wrong." Her logic, simple and direct, cut through the adult complexities surrounding them. "Is Uncle Jake in trouble?" Thomas chose his words deliberately. "Uncle Jake is sick. I'm going to go see him tomorrow, and Rex is going to help." "I want to come too," Lily insisted. "Immediately. Not this time, kiddo." Thomas brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Uncle Jake is in a special hospital where children aren't allowed. You need to stay here with Aunt Catherine where it's safe." "But Rex gets to go." Her lower lip trembled slightly. "Rex has a special job to do," Thomas explained. "Remember how he used to find hidden things when he was a working dog? We need him to help the doctors." This explanation seemed to satisfy her, though her expression remained troubled. "Will you tell Uncle Jake I made him a picture? And that I'm not mad he isn't really dead?" Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I promise." Later, after Lily had been tucked into bed in the guest room she used during visits, Thomas sat on the back porch with Catherine, Rex lying vigilantly at his feet. The security detail maintained their positions around the property perimeter, shadows occasionally visible as they patrolled the grounds. "You know Lily's going to have questions I can't answer," Catherine said, sipping a glass of bourbon. "That child is too perceptive for her own good." "Just tell her I'm helping Uncle Jake get better," Thomas replied. "It's not a lie." Catherine studied her brother's profile, illuminated by the soft porch lights. "This is serious, isn't it? Beyond the obvious drama of faking Jake's death." Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the manicured lawn. "Kate, if anything happens to me—" "Don't," she interrupted sharply. "Don't you dare start with 'if anything happens to me' speeches." "I need to say this," Thomas insisted. "Quietly. If anything happens, Lily's legal guardianship transfers to you. All the paperwork was updated after Sarah died. There's a trust fund for her education, and my military benefits would provide monthly support." Catherine set down her glass, turning fully toward her brother. "Thomas Morgan, you listen to me. You are coming back from wherever they're sending. You and we are going to get through this as a family. I refuse to tell that little girl upstairs that she's lost someone else." Thomas wished he could share his sister's certainty. The grim expressions of the experts during his briefing had communicated a severity that went beyond standard operational concerns. Whatever had happened to Jake, whatever was still happening to him, carried implications that had top military and intelligence officials operating on emergency protocols. "I'll go with you to the handoff point," Catherine said, changing tactics when Thomas remained silent. "Where are they sending the escort?" 600 at the eastern property entrance, Thomas replied. "Hayes is sending a team to transport Rex and me directly to the facility." "Which is where, exactly?" "I don't know yet," Thomas admitted. "Secure location. That's all they've said." Catherine frowned. "They're taking my brother and his dog to an undisclosed location to deal with a situation involving our other brother who was declared dead less than 24 hours ago. And I'm supposed to just accept this?" "For now," Thomas said simply. "Please, Kate, trust me." The night passed fitfully, Thomas dozing intermittently in the guest room adjacent to Lily's. Each time he woke, he found Rex still alert, positioned between the bed and the door as if standing guard. The German shepherd's behavior had shifted subtly since the funeral, more vigilant, more protective, as if he sensed that his discovery had set dangerous wheels in motion. Shortly before dawn, Thomas quietly packed the small bag of essentials. Catherine had provided and prepared Rex's service vest, not officially required since his retirement, but useful for establishing his status in high-security environments. As he fastened the familiar Kevlar-reinforced material around the dog's muscular frame, Rex stood perfectly still, his posture shifting from family pet to working dog with practiced ease. "You remember this, don't you, buddy?" Thomas murmured, checking the fit. "Back to work one more time." Rex's intelligent eyes met his, a depth of understanding passing between them that transcended the human-canine divide. 8 years of partnership had created a bond that sometimes felt telepathic in its dimensionality, each able to read the other's intentions through the subtlest shifts in posture or expression. They found Catherine in the kitchen, already dressed, and brewing coffee. She wordlessly handed Thomas a travel mug and a bag containing sandwiches and protein bars. "Military habits die hard," she said, when he raised an eyebrow at the pre-dawn meal preparation. "I remember what it was like growing up with you three always deploying somewhere. Never let my brothers leave without food." The simple gesture, so reminiscent of their mother's practices during their childhood, threatened to crack Thomas's carefully maintained composure. The Morgan siblings had lost both parents years ago. They were each other's only remaining family, beyond Thomas's daughter. "Kate," he began, but she shook her head. "Just bring both my brothers home," she said firmly. "That's all I'm asking." A discreet text alert on Thomas's phone signaled the arrival of their transport. He knelt to Rex's level, running through a quick series of command checks to ensure the German shepherd was properly oriented to working status. Rex responded flawlessly, his focus sharpening, his responses immediate and precise. "Good boy," Thomas affirmed, offering a brief reward pat before standing. "Let's go." Catherine walked them to the side door that led toward the eastern property entrance. In the pre-dawn darkness, Thomas could make out two black SUVs with government plates waiting at the end of the private drive. 6 figures stood at strategic positions around the vehicles, standard security formation for high-value transport. "Thomas," Catherine said as he prepared to leave, her hand on his arm, "whatever this is, whatever happened to Jake, you're not alone in it. Remember that." He nodded, unable to find adequate words for the moment. With a final squeeze of his sister's hand, he signaled Rex to heel and moved toward the waiting vehicles. Major Dawson, who had escorted Lily the previous day, stepped forward to meet them. "Sir, we have a 3-hour transport window to the facility. Dog equipment has been loaded per specifications." "His name is Rex," Thomas corrected automatically, the same way he had at the briefing. Names mattered. They were the difference between seeing his partner as equipment and recognizing him as a sentient contributor to the mission. "Yes, sir." Rex has a secured position in the lead vehicle. Dawson's professional demeanor softened slightly. "He's something else, isn't he? The way he detected the anomaly at the funeral. We've got K9 units that trained for years that couldn't have made that call." "He's the best," Thomas agreed simply as they approached the vehicles. Special Forces K9 teams tried to recruit him 3 times before he was retired. The journey began in tense silence, Rex positioned in a specially designed harness in the back seat beside Thomas. The German Shepherd remained alert, occasionally turning his attention to the passing landscape as they left Nashville and headed east into the Tennessee mountains. Thomas recognized the general direction. They were heading toward the Oak Ridge Complex, the historic site of the Manhattan Project, now home to various Department of Energy and military research facilities. His suspicion was confirmed when, approximately 2 hours into the journey, they turned onto a restricted access road, marked only with numerical designations rather than place names. The vehicles passed through 3 security checkpoints, each more stringent than the last, before arriving at what appeared to be a recent addition to the sprawling government complex. A gleaming white structure partially built into the mountainside, its modern architectural lines at odds with the older facilities nearby. "Chimera facility," Dawson said, noting Thomas's questioning look. "Came online 18 months ago. Officially, a joint military Department of Energy research station specializing in advanced biometric security systems." "And unofficially?" Thomas asked. "Above my clearance level, sir," Dawson replied smoothly as they pulled to a stop at a final checkpoint. "This is as far as my team goes. You'll be met by facility personnel from here." As if on cue, a group of 4 individuals emerged from the building's main entrance, 3 wearing the distinctive tactical gear of specialized security units, and 1 in a white lab coat. The latter approached as Thomas exited the vehicle and signaled Rex to follow. Major Morgan, the woman in the lab coat, greeted him, her accent faintly Eastern European. "I am Dr. Nadia Petrov, Chief Medical Officer of Chimera Facility. Welcome." Her gaze shifted to Rex, clinical interest evident in her expression. "And this is the animal that detected our containment protocols." "This is Rex," Thomas confirmed, noting her choice of words. "Not the dog that found the deception, but the animal that detected our containment protocols." The distinction felt significant. "He's a retired military working dog with specialized detection training," Dr. Petrov nodded. "Impressive capabilities. We've prepared accordingly." She gestured toward the entrance. "If you'll follow me, we've scheduled your meeting with Captain Morgan for 0930. Before that, there are required briefings and preparation protocols." The interior of the facility belied its relatively modest external appearance. Beyond the initial security screening areas lay a complex of laboratories, medical suites, and research stations that rivaled anything Thomas had seen during his military career. Personnel in various uniforms and lab attire moved purposefully through the space, many casting curious glances at Rex, who maintained perfect discipline at Thomas's side. Dr. Petrov led them to a conference room where Deputy Director Landry and Colonel Hayes were already waiting, along with several individuals Thomas didn't recognize. "Major Morgan and the asset have arrived," Dr. Petrov announced, again referring to Rex in terms that made Thomas bristle internally. "Thank you, Doctor," Landry acknowledged before addressing Thomas directly. "Major, before we proceed to Captain Morgan's containment suite, you need to understand exactly what we're dealing with and the strict protocols in place." One of the strangers, a man in his 60s with the weathered complexion of someone who had spent significant time in harsh environments, stepped forward. "I'm Dr. Victor Hargrove, lead researcher on Project Chimera. What I'm about to share is classified beyond top secret. Disclosure of any kind would constitute treason against the United States." Thomas nodded his understanding, his attention split between the briefing and Rex, who had begun to display subtle signs of alertness, nothing that would register to the average observer, but indicators Thomas recognized from their years working together in high-threat environments. The German shepherd's ear position had shifted slightly, his breathing pattern had changed, and his muscles had tensed in a specific configuration that typically signaled detection of a potential threat. Something in this facility was triggering Rex's training, something he recognized as dangerous. 3 months ago, Dr. Hargrove began, our intelligence assets identified a research program being conducted by a non-state organization with significant resources and advanced scientific capabilities. This program, codenamed Lazarus by our analysts, appeared to focus on creating a bioorganic agent capable of cellular regeneration and modification at unprecedented levels. Hargrove activated a display screen showing microscopic imagery of what appeared to be human cells undergoing rapid transformation. Initial intelligence suggested applications ranging from advanced battlefield medicine to biological weapons capable of targeting specific genetic profiles. Captain Morgan's team was dispatched to confirm the intelligence and, if possible, obtain samples for analysis. Thomas watched the cellular imagery with growing unease, Rex's tension communicating itself through the leash. And they succeeded. "Yes and no," Dr. Petrov interjected. "They obtained samples, but as you know, during extraction, containment was compromised. Captain Morgan was exposed directly to the active agent." Hargrove continued, "Standard protocol for biological exposure in field operations is immediate. Quarantine and, if necessary, neutralization of the affected operative." His clinical tone made Thomas's blood run cold. However, Captain Morgan's physical response to the agent was unprecedented. Rather than showing signs of infection, degradation, or conventional symptoms, he began displaying enhanced cellular regeneration. "Enhanced how?" Thomas asked, dreading the answer. Dr. Petrov took over, her scientific detachment slightly tempered by what might have been compassion. Captain Morgan had sustained multiple gunshot wounds during the extraction. Upon exposure to the agent, these wounds began healing at approximately 40 times the normal human rate. Within hours, tissue that should have taken weeks to regenerate was fully restored. Thomas struggled to process this information. "You're saying this thing cured him?" "Not exactly," Hargrove clarified. "The agent appears to have integrated with his cellular structure, creating a symbiotic relationship that continues to evolve. It's not simply healing damage, it's actively rewriting aspects of his biology." Colonel Hayes, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. "Thomas, Jake's condition is stable but progressive. The changes are accelerating in ways we don't fully understand. That's why we maintained the fiction of his death, not just to protect the intelligence regarding the Lazarus Project, but to prevent those who created it from learning that we have a living host who appears to be successfully integrating with the agent. Successfully? Thomas repeated incredulously. You make it sound like this is a positive development. From a purely scientific perspective, Dr. Petrov said carefully, it represents an evolutionary leap in human biological capabilities. From a national security perspective, however, it presents unprecedented risks and challenges. Landry, who had been observing the conversation with calculating eyes, finally spoke. Major Morgan, your brother represents both the greatest biological breakthrough and the most significant potential threat we've encountered in decades. If the integration continues on its current trajectory, we're looking at capabilities that exceed normal human limitations by orders of magnitude. And if it goes wrong, Thomas asked quietly. The silence that followed was answer enough. That's where your partner comes in, Dr. Hargrove said, gesturing toward Rex. The canine's reaction at the funeral suggests he can detect subtle changes in the bioagent's structure and activity. If he could distinguish between the neutralized sample in the casket and recognize it as wrong, he may be able to identify critical changes in Captain Morgan's condition that our instruments can't yet calibrate for. Thomas glanced down at Rex, who remained in a state of controlled alertness, his attention now fixed on a sealed door at the far end of the facility. The German Shepherd's behavior confirmed what Thomas had already suspected. He was detecting something significant beyond that barrier. What exactly do you need Rex to do? Thomas asked, his protective instincts extending equally to his brother and his canine partner. Dr. Petrov consulted a tablet. We've prepared a series of progressive exposure protocols. First, to confirm the dog's ability to detect the bioagent in various states of activity. Then, calibrated interactions with Captain Morgan under controlled conditions. You want to use Rex as a living detection system, Thomas translated, not bothering to hide his discomfort with the idea. To put it bluntly, yes, Landry confirmed. If this dog can alert to changes in the bioagent's behavior before our equipment registers them, he could provide critical advance warning of dangerous developments. Hayes, perhaps sensing Thomas's growing resistance, added, Jake asked for this, Thomas. When he understood what was happening to him, he specifically requested that if things progressed beyond certain parameters, we should bring in specialized detection assets. He meant hazmat teams and biochemical sensors, Thomas countered. Not his brother's retired K9. Actually, Hayes said quietly, he mentioned Rex specifically during one of his more lucid periods 3 days ago. Said something about Rex being able to smell the truth when machines lie. We dismissed it as delirium at the time. This revelation shifted something in Thomas's understanding of the situation. Jake had asked for Rex, had somehow anticipated or intuited that his former canine partner might perceive what advanced technology could not. I want to see him first, Thomas insisted. Before Rex does, I need to understand what we're dealing with. The scientists exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them before Dr. Petrov nodded. That can be arranged. However, there are strict biosecurity protocols you must follow. Captain Morgan is contained in a negative pressure environment with multiple barrier systems. Will I be able to speak with him directly? Yes, through an intercom system. Physical contact is absolutely prohibited. Dr. Petrov's tone left no room for negotiation on this point. Even with the agent appearing stable in his system, we cannot risk potential transmission. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Thomas underwent a comprehensive medical screening, signed multiple non-disclosure agreements with increasingly severe penalties, and was fitted with a specialized biosecurity suit designed to prevent any possibility of contamination. Throughout this process, Rex remained with him, supervised by a veterinary specialist who checked the dog's vitals and fitted him with monitoring sensors disguised within a modified tactical vest. The sensors will track his physiological responses to the bioagent, the specialist explained as she secured the final components: heart rate, respiratory patterns, subtle muscle movements, all the indicators that you, as his handler, would recognize as alerts. Thomas appreciated the thoroughness of their approach, even as he remained wary of the risks to his partner. Rex had been trained to detect numerous hazardous substances, from explosives to narcotics, but never a cutting-edge bioagent capable of rewriting human cellular structure. Finally, they were led to a sealed chamber adjacent to what Dr. Petrov referred to as the containment suite. The space resembled an airlock, with reinforced viewing windows and sophisticated monitoring equipment lining the walls. "Major Morgan will proceed first," Dr. Petrov instructed the security team. "Once his interaction is complete and decontamination protocols have been observed, we'll prepare the canine for controlled exposure." Thomas knelt beside Rex, making direct eye contact with his partner. "Stay," he commanded firmly, infusing the simple word with all the authority of their years working together. "Security watch." Rex responded immediately, settling into the vigilant posture that indicated he understood this was a working situation, requiring his complete focus. The German Shepherd would remain exactly where positioned until Thomas returned or issued a countermanding order. As Thomas entered the airlock system that would lead to Jake's containment area, he felt a profound sense of crossing a threshold. Not just the physical barriers of a high-security facility, but a boundary between the world as he had understood it and something new and potentially terrifying. The final door hissed open, revealing a spacious room that resembled a hybrid between a hospital suite and a laboratory. Medical monitoring equipment lined one wall, while another featured an array of scientific instruments Thomas couldn't begin to identify. The space was divided by a transparent barrier of what appeared to be reinforced glass, creating a visible but impenetrable boundary between the entry area where Thomas stood and the living quarters on the other side. And there, seated in a chair, beside a hospital-style bed, was Jake. Thomas's first thought was that his brother looked remarkably normal, perhaps healthier than when Thomas had last seen him 6 months earlier before his deployment. Jake's physical appearance showed no obvious signs of the extraordinary changes supposedly occurring within his body. His military short hair was the same dark brown it had always been. His build still reflected the lean musculature of special forces training, and his posture maintained the alert readiness characteristic of seasoned operators. It was only as Jake looked up, sensing Thomas's presence, that the difference became apparent. His eyes, once the same deep brown as Thomas's own, now contained flecks of amber that seemed to shift and reconfigure as he blinked, creating an unsettling impression of internal movement. "Tommy," Jake said, rising from the chair with fluid. "Grace." His voice sounded normal, perhaps slightly deeper than Thomas remembered. "They finally let you come." "Jake," Thomas managed, the surreal nature of the situation momentarily robbing him of further words. His brother had been declared dead, his funeral held, his life officially ended, yet here he stood, apparently whole but fundamentally altered in ways Thomas was only beginning to comprehend. Jake approached the transparent barrier, studying Thomas with an intensity that felt both familiar and alien. "You found the deception," he stated. "How?" "Not me," Thomas replied, finding his voice. "Rex. He alerted on the casket during the funeral. Wouldn't stop until they opened it." Something like satisfaction crossed Jake's features. "Good dog, I knew he would." "You knew?" Thomas stepped closer to the barrier, close enough to see his own reflection ghosted over his brother's form. Jake, What's happening to you? They've told me fragments, clinical descriptions, but I need to hear it from you." Jake's expression shifted, a complexity of emotions playing across features that had always been easily readable to his brother. Now Thomas found himself struggling to interpret what he saw. Recognition and alienation seemed to coexist in the same expressions. "It's difficult to explain," Jake began, his voice measured as if carefully selecting each word. "The agent they call Lazarus, it's not just in my system, Tommy. It's becoming my system, rewriting cellular structures, neural pathways, sensory capabilities. I can feel it happening, feel the changes spreading throughout my body." "Is it painful?" Thomas asked, the question emerging from the core of brotherly concern that transcended the bizarre circumstances. "Not exactly painful," Jake replied thoughtfully. "More intense, like every cell is suddenly awake and aware in ways the human body isn't designed to process." He flexed his fingers, studying them with clinical detachment. The bullet wounds from the extraction healed completely in under 6 hours. A broken rib from the firefight re-knit itself by the time they had me in the transport. That should be impossible. Thomas processed this information, trying to find solid ground in a situation that seemed to shift with each new revelation. "The scientists say it's changing you at a fundamental level, that you're becoming something else." "They're right," Jake confirmed, his altered eyes fixing on Thomas with unsettling directness. "But what they don't fully understand yet is that it's not random mutation. The changes are purposeful, directed. This agent was engineered with specific outcomes in mind." "What outcomes?" Thomas asked, though he wasn't certain he wanted the answer. Jake was silent for a moment, seeming to debate how much to reveal. "Enhanced soldiers, initially, warriors who could regenerate from catastrophic injuries, operate beyond normal human limitations, adapt to any environment or threat." His expression darkened. But that was just the beginning of what its creators envisioned. The ultimate goal was transformation, creating a new category of human with capabilities that would render conventional warfare obsolete. The clinical detachment in Jake's voice, as he described his own transformation, sent a chill through Thomas. This didn't sound like the brother he knew, the man who had joined the military out of a sense of duty and protection, who had always maintained his humanity even in the most dehumanizing combat situations. "Jake," Thomas said carefully, "are you still you? Does your mind feel different?" A ghost of Jake's familiar smile appeared, though it didn't quite reach his strangely altered eyes. "That's the question they ask me every day, in 100 different ways. The answer is complicated. My memories are intact. I remember growing up in Tennessee, Mom's apple pie, Dad teaching us to fish. I remember your wedding to Sarah, being Lily's godfather." His expression softened at the mention of his niece. "How is she?" "Confused, scared, but resilient," Thomas answered honestly. "She knows something is wrong, but not what. She asked me to tell you she made you a picture." Jake's composure faltered momentarily, genuine emotion breaking through the controlled facade. "She's a good kid, better than any of us deserve." He seemed to collect himself, returning to their previous thread. "My core identity feels stable, but my perspective is expanding. I perceive connections I couldn't before, process information differently. Sometimes it feels like I'm observing myself from a distance, watching as this thing reshapes me according to its programming." "Can it be reversed?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Jake shook his head. "The integration is too complete. The Lazarus agent has encoded itself into my DNA, merged with my cellular structures. Removing it now would be like trying to separate salt from seawater. Theoretically possible, but practically impossible without destroying the host." Thomas absorbed this grim assessment, the full weight of his brother's situation settling over him. Jake was trapped in an irreversible transformation, becoming the living embodiment of an engineered bioweapon whose full capabilities and intentions remained unknown. "That's why I asked for Rex," Jake continued, his tone shifting to one of urgent purpose. "He'll detect changes that the scientists miss. Their instruments measure what they expect to find, but Rex responds to reality as it exists, not as humans conceptualize it." "You remembered he served with both of us," Thomas said, a statement rather than a question. Jake nodded. "Rex knows my baseline, how I should smell, sound, even move. He'll recognize deviations that indicate dangerous progression." His expression grew more intense. "Tommy, you need to understand something crucial. The people who created Lazarus, they engineered fail-safes into the agent. If the host integration proceeds beyond certain parameters, the programming changes." "Changes how?" Thomas asked, though dread was already building in his chest. "From symbiosis to replacement," Jake answered grimly. "If the transformation reaches critical threshold, the original personality, me, Jake Morgan, becomes subordinate to the agent's core directives. I would still exist, but as a passenger in my own body, watching as something else takes control." The implications were horrifying. Jake wasn't just describing physical transformation, but the potential annihilation of his self-identity, his very personhood. "The scientists know this?" "They suspect," Jake confirmed. "But their detection methods lag behind the progression. By the time their instruments confirm the critical threshold, it will already be too late." His gaze became unnervingly direct. "That's why I need Rex. He'll know before anyone else when I stop being Jake and start becoming something else entirely." Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders, not just for his brother's condition, but for what might need to be done if the transformation progressed beyond the point of no return. "What happens if Rex alerts? What are we supposed to do?" Jake's expression hardened into something resolute and terrible. "You know what needs to happen, Tommy. The same choice we were always trained to make when a situation becomes containment impossible." Thomas recoiled instinctively from what his brother was suggesting. "No, there has to be another option. The scientists, they're working on treatments, stabilization protocols." "They're scientists," Jake interrupted, a flicker of his old intensity breaking through. "Their primary directive is knowledge acquisition. Even if this costs me my humanity, the data they collect will be considered valuable." His voice dropped lower. "The military contingent has different priorities, but they're equally dangerous. Some see Lazarus as the next revolution in warfare. They're already calculating applications, even as they pretend concern about containment." A growing sense of isolation washed over Thomas as he realized the true nature of the situation. Jake wasn't just a patient or research subject. He was a living weapon in development, a potential asset whose value might eventually outweigh his humanity in the cold calculations of national security. "I brought Rex to help you, not to—" Thomas couldn't complete the sentence. "To help me remain me," Jake finished for him, "for as long as possible. But if that becomes impossible—" He placed his hand against the transparent barrier, a gesture so human and vulnerable that it made the surrounding circumstance all the more tragic. "I'm trusting you to make the right call when the time comes. Not the scientists, not the military, not whatever I might become. You, Tommy, my brother." Before Thomas could respond, the intercom system activated with Dr. Petrov's clinical voice. "Major Morgan, your initial assessment period is complete. Please proceed to the decontamination chamber for processing." The timing felt deliberate, as if they had been monitoring the conversation and intervened precisely when it veered into territory they preferred not to have documented. Thomas met his brother's gaze one final time, trying to memorize the face that, despite its subtle alterations, still belonged to the person who had been his constant companion throughout childhood, his fellow soldier, his family. "I'll bring Rex soon," Thomas promised. "Just hold on to yourself, Jake, whatever it takes." Jake nodded, a ghost of his old smile appearing. "Tell Lily I loved her picture, even though I haven't seen it yet." As Thomas turned to enter the decontamination chamber, he felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down upon him. His brother was asking him to be both savior and executioner, to help preserve his humanity for as long as possible, and to recognize when that humanity was finally irrevocably lost. And Rex, the loyal partner who had already altered the course of events once by detecting the funeral deception, would now be asked to make the most terrible determination of all. When Jake Morgan ceased to be himself and became something humanity had never encountered before. The decontamination process was thorough and impersonal, a series of chemical showers, UV light exposures, and medical scans that stripped away not just potential biological contaminants, but also the emotional weight of Thomas's encounter with Jake. By the time he emerged from the final chamber, dressed in fresh, facility-provided clothing, Thomas felt hollowed out, his brother's revelations echoing in the empty spaces. Dr. Petrov was waiting with a data tablet and clinical expression. "Your biological markers are clear, no indication of exposure or contamination. I was behind 6 inches of reinforced barrier the entire time," Thomas pointed out, the edge in his voice sharper than intended. "Contamination wasn't a realistic concern. We take no chances with Lazarus," she replied, unperturbed by his tone. "The agent has demonstrated capabilities that consistently exceed our predictive models." She studied him with professional detachment. "Your conversation with Captain Morgan was illuminating. The implication that they had been monitoring every word, perhaps analyzing his brother's statements against some metric of human versus non-human response, sent a fresh wave of anger through Thomas. "You mean you were surprised he still sounds like himself? Still remembers who he is?" Dr. Petrov's expression softened marginally. "On the contrary, Major, we are tracking his psychological continuity very carefully. Captain Morgan's sense of self has remained remarkably stable despite the profound biological changes underway." She hesitated, appearing to make a calculation about how much to reveal. "Not all exposed subjects maintain such coherence." The casual reference to other subjects caught Thomas off guard. "There have been others. Other people exposed to Lazarus." The doctor's momentary silence confirmed his suspicion before she carefully responded. "The organization that developed Lazarus conducted extensive human trials before we became aware of their program. The intelligence your brother's team recovered included partial data on these trials. The results were varied, meaning what exactly? Meaning that your brother's integration with the agent is unprecedented in its stability and retention of original personality markers. Most subjects experience complete psychological dissolution within 72 hours of exposure." Her clinical tone couldn't quite disguise the horror inherent in what she was describing. They became something else entirely. Thomas processed this new information with growing dread. "And you think Jake is different because unknown," Dr. Petrov admitted. "Possibly a genetic factor, possibly his psychological profile, possibly random chance. We're investigating all possibilities." A new thought occurred to Thomas. "The Lazarus agent, it's intelligent, isn't it? Not just a biological compound, but something programmed, directed." Dr. Petrov's slight hesitation told him he'd struck close to a truth they hadn't fully shared. "It contains computational elements at the molecular level that suggest a form of biological programming, yes. Whether that constitutes intelligence in any meaningful sense is still under investigation. "My brother thinks it does," Thomas said quietly. "He believes it has purpose, that it's reshaping him according to specific directives." Captain Morgan's perspectives on his condition are valuable data points, Dr. Petrov replied, neatly sidestepping any confirmation or denial. "Which brings us to the next phase of assessment." She gestured toward the security door. "Your partner has been prepared for controlled introduction." Thomas followed her back to the preparation area where Rex was waiting, still wearing the sensor-equipped tactical vest. The German shepherd rose immediately at Thomas's approach, his disciplined posture relaxing slightly in recognition before resuming professional alertness. "We've calibrated the monitoring systems to baseline against his known detection behaviors," explained a technician who'd been monitoring Rex. "The sensors will track micro-expressions, respiratory changes, heart rate fluctuations, all the indicators that typically precede a formal alert." Thomas nodded, appreciating the technical thoroughness while remaining skeptical of its application. Rex's detection capabilities had always contained elements that defied mechanical replication or understanding. Intuitive leaps and contextual assessments that the best technology struggled to quantify. "What's the protocol for this introduction?" Thomas asked, kneeling to check Rex's equipment personally, a habit from their working days that prioritized handler verification over technical assurances. "Progressive exposure," Dr. Petrov explained. "First, we'll introduce Rex to a sealed container with a neutralized sample of the Lazarus agent, similar to what was in the casket, but in a controlled environment. This establishes a detection baseline, then samples with incrementally active properties, measuring his reactions to each. Finally, supervised observation of Captain Morgan through the containment barrier." Thomas considered the approach, finding it methodologically sound while still harboring reservations about putting Rex in proximity to something that could fundamentally alter living organisms. "And the safety protocols for Rex? What happens if there's accidental exposure?" "The canine will remain in specialized protective gear throughout the process," Dr. Petrov assured him. "Additionally, we've developed a rapid response neutralizing agent specifically calibrated for Lazarus. In the highly unlikely event of exposure, it would be administered immediately." Thomas wasn't entirely reassured, but he recognized that they had progressed beyond the point where he could realistically abort the process. They were here. Jake was transforming, and Rex represented a unique detection capability that might prove crucial in preventing whatever catastrophic outcome his brother had alluded to. "All right," Thomas agreed finally, "but I maintain handler override authority throughout. If I determine at any point that Rex is at risk, we terminate the assessment immediately. Is that clear?" Dr. Petrov nodded, though Thomas suspected her acquiescence was more professional courtesy than genuine acceptance of his terms. In a facility like this, operating under whatever classified authority governed Project Chimera, standard protocols could be overridden at any moment deemed necessary by those in command. The testing sequence began in a specialized laboratory adjacent to Jake's containment area. Thomas and Rex were positioned at one end of a long room, while technicians in full protective gear managed the progressive introduction of sealed sample containers at carefully measured distances. The first container, holding what Dr. Petrov described as completely neutralized Lazarus components, elicited only moderate interest from Rex. The German shepherd detected its presence, turning his attention toward it with professional curiosity rather than alarm. "He recognizes it as something to be noted, but not as a threat," Thomas translated, reading Rex's body language with the fluency of their years together. "This is similar to how he would respond to residual explosive compounds that have been rendered inert." The second sample, containing what the scientists described as minimally active components, produced a more pronounced reaction. Rex's posture stiffened, his ears pivoting forward, and his nose working more actively to process the scent markers. Still, he made no move to alert formally, maintaining his position beside Thomas with disciplined restraint. Increased interest, elevated concern, but still within assessment parameters rather than threat response, Thomas narrated, as the scientists recorded both Rex's reactions and his interpretations. The progression continued through 4 additional samples of increasing activity levels. With each, Rex's responses grew more pronounced. Shifts in breathing patterns, subtle muscle tensions, the micro-signals that an experienced handler could read like text, but that remained largely invisible to untrained observers. The final sample, described as active but contained Lazarus components at 20% of full potential, crossed a threshold in Rex's assessment. The German Shepherd moved from passive detection to active alert, assuming the rigid posture and focused attention that signaled identification of a critical threat. He did not bark. He had been trained for silent alerts in tactical situations, but his entire body communicated unmistakable alarm. "Full threat detection," Thomas confirmed as the scientists noted the response. "This is equivalent to his reaction to active explosives or battlefield toxins. He's identifying it as immediately dangerous." Dr. Petrov studied the readings from Rex's sensor vest with intense interest. The physiological markers are remarkably consistent and graduated across the spectrum of samples. Heart rate, respiratory patterns, muscle tension, all show predictable progression correlated with the activity level of the agent. She looked up at Thomas with newfound respect. "Your partner's detection capabilities are extraordinarily precise. He was the top detection dog in 3 separate deployment zones," Thomas replied, allowing a hint of pride to color his professional assessment. "There's a reason Jake specifically asked for him." The mention of Jake seemed to remind Dr. Petrov of the next phase in their protocol. "We should proceed to direct observation. Captain Morgan has been prepared for the interaction." Thomas felt a flutter of apprehension as he considered what prepared might mean in this context, but he kept his expression neutral as he commanded Rex to heel and followed the scientific team toward Jake's containment area. This time, they were directed to a different observation room than the one Thomas had used for his initial meeting. This space was arranged to allow Rex clear visual and olfactory access to the containment chamber while maintaining the strict barrier protocols that prevented any possibility of direct contact. Jake was already positioned on the other side of the transparent barrier when they entered, seated in a chair approximately 10 feet from the dividing wall. Thomas noted immediately that his brother's appearance had subtly changed in the hours since their earlier meeting. The amber flecks in his eyes seemed more pronounced, and there was a new fluid quality to his posture, as if the normal constraints of human musculature and skeletal structure were becoming increasingly irrelevant to his movement. Rex's reaction was immediate and complex. The German Shepherd froze at the threshold of the observation room, his attention locked on Jake with an intensity that communicated clear recognition combined with profound confusion. A high-pitched whine escaped him, the first vocalization he had made during any of the testing procedures. "Easy, Rex," Thomas murmured, resting his hand lightly on the dog's shoulder in reassurance. "It's okay." Jake leaned forward slightly, studying Rex with an expression that seemed to contain both his familiar affection for the dog who had once been his partner and something else, a clinical curiosity that felt distinctly alien. "He recognizes me," Jake observed, his voice carrying clearly through the intercom system, "but he's confused by the changes." Thomas nodded, carefully monitoring Rex's responses. The German Shepherd was exhibiting a complex mixture of behaviors, the relaxed familiarity He typically showed around known individuals combined with the alert tension that indicated detection of potentially threatening elements. He's processing conflicting signals, Thomas explained, as much for the observing scientists as for Jake. Your scent profile contains both familiar human markers he associates with you and unfamiliar components that register as similar to the samples he just evaluated. Jake nodded, unsurprised. The Lazarus integration has progressed approximately 18% since this morning, according to the latest cellular scans. I can feel the acceleration. The casual way Jake referenced his own transformation, as if discussing a weather pattern rather than a fundamental alteration of his humanity, sent a chill through Thomas. This clinical detachment felt like evidence of the very process Jake had warned about, the gradual subsumption of his human identity into something other. Rex took a hesitant step forward, then another, approaching the transparent barrier with cautious determination. His nose worked rapidly, sampling the air for the complex scent molecules that could penetrate even the sophisticated filtration systems of the containment area. "What is he telling you?" Dr. Petrov asked, her attention divided between Rex's behavior and the data streaming from his sensor vest to the monitoring equipment. Thomas watched his partner carefully, reading the subtle language of canine assessment that they had refined through years of battlefield detection work. He's identifying Jake as both familiar and changed, not yet registering him as a primary threat, but noting significant alteration from baseline memory. "That tracks with our measurements," Dr. Hargrove commented, studying a different data readout. "Captain Morgan's cellular structure shows approximately 82% conformity with human baseline, 18% novel configuration." Jake rose from his chair and approached the barrier, moving with that unsettling new fluidity that seemed to bypass normal human biomechanics. At his approach, Rex's behavior shifted again, his posture stiffening, ears flattening slightly, a low growl building in his chest. "Increased threat assessment," Thomas narrated, keeping his voice calm and professional, despite the emotional toll of watching his canine partner register his brother as a potential danger. "He's responding to something specific in Jake's movement patterns." Jake stopped, observing Rex's reaction with that same uncanny mixture of familiar human concern and alien analytical interest. "The integration is affecting my motor control. Basic movements now incorporate efficiency modifications that weren't present in my original physical patterns," he demonstrated by lifting his hand in what should have been a simple gesture, but now contained a disturbing economy of motion, as if unnecessary micro-movements had been eliminated from the action. Rex's growl deepened, though he held his position beside Thomas without retreating or advancing further. "He's right at the threshold between recognition and alert," Thomas explained. "He still identifies Jake as Jake, but with concerning modifications that trigger his threat detection training." Dr. Petrov made notes on her tablet. "This is precisely the calibration mechanism we hoped for. The canine is establishing a baseline for acceptable variation versus concerning progression." Thomas resisted the urge to correct her depersonalized reference to Rex again, focusing instead on the implications of what they were witnessing. If Rex was already registering Jake's transformation as approaching threat threshold at just 18% integration, what would happen as the process continued to accelerate? At what point would Rex stop recognizing Jake as Jake at all and begin treating him as an unknown hostile entity? More disturbingly, what would that transition signify about his brother's fundamental identity? Jake had warned that beyond a certain threshold, his original personality would become subordinate to the Lazarus programming. Rex might be their only reliable indicator of when that critical line was crossed. Jake seemed to follow Thomas's thought process, his altered eyes meeting his brother's with a flash of the old connection that had always existed between them. He'll know, Tommy, before anyone else does. That's why I needed him here. The use of the childhood nickname, combined with the grim understanding underlying the statement, threatened to crack Thomas's carefully maintained professional demeanor. This was his brother, asking him to witness and respond to his possible dissolution as a human being, using the very partner who had been part of both their lives as the measuring instrument for that terrible transition. "Captain Morgan," Dr. Hargrove interjected, "we're detecting increased neural activity in your frontal and temporal lobes. Are you experiencing any cognitive changes during this interaction?" Jake's focus shifted to the scientist, and something in his expression changed, became more remote, more analytical. "Yes, observing Rex is triggering memory cascades and associated emotional responses. The Lazarus components are processing these responses differently than my baseline neurological patterns would." "Processing how?" Hargrove pressed, his scientific curiosity evident. "Categorizing, evaluating utility versus inefficiency." Jake's voice had taken on a subtly different cadence. "Emotional attachment creates behavioral predictability. Predictability can be leveraged. The dog represents a significant attachment node in the original personality structure." Thomas felt his blood run cold at the clinically distant way Jake had just referred to himself in the third person as the original personality structure, rather than as me or I. It suggested exactly the kind of dissociative transition Jake had warned about, the emergence of something else that viewed his human identity as a separate entity to be analyzed and potentially utilized. Rex clearly detected the shift as well. The German Shepherd's posture changed instantly, dropping into the alert stance he had been trained to assume when identifying an active threat. His growl deepened, teeth now partially visible, body tensed for potential action. Full threat detection. Thomas reported automatically, professional habits overriding his emotional reaction. He's no longer registering ambiguity. Something just crossed a threshold in his assessment. Jake blinked, and the strange, dissociative quality seemed to recede from his expression. He took a deliberate step back from the barrier, his face registering something like shock or alarm. "I felt it," he said, his voice once again recognizably his own. "For a moment I was observing myself from outside, analyzing my own emotional responses as data points rather than experiences." He looked directly at Thomas, real fear visible in his strangely altered eyes. "It's happening faster than they predicted. The integration is accelerating." Dr. Petrov and Dr. Hargrove were both furiously taking notes, their scientific excitement barely contained beneath professional demeanors. Thomas recognized their expressions. They were witnessing unprecedented data, extraordinary confirmation of theoretical models, career-defining observations. What they weren't seeing, or perhaps were choosing not to acknowledge, was the human tragedy unfolding before them. A man gradually losing himself to something inhuman, witnessing his own transformation with the horrified clarity of someone still conscious enough to understand what he was becoming. "I think that's enough for today," Thomas said firmly, resting his hand on Rex's head to calm the continuing growl. "Rex has established baseline detection parameters for the current integration level. We need to process this data before proceeding further." Dr. Petrov looked as if she might object, but Colonel Hayes, who had been observing silently from the back of the room, stepped forward. "Major Morgan is correct. We've collected sufficient initial data. Let's analyze what we have before the next observation session." As they prepared to exit the observation area, Jake called out, "Tommy!" When Thomas turned back, his brother's expression had regained its humanity, a flash of the old Jake breaking through the increasingly alien facade. "Remember what I asked. When the time comes." Thomas could only nod, the weight of that terrible promise settling deeper into his consciousness. As the door sealed behind them, separating brother from brother once more, Thomas found himself wondering how many more times he would look into those increasingly altered eyes and still find Jake. Looking back, Thomas spent the next 3 hours in debriefing sessions that felt more like interrogations than scientific discussions. Each team within the facility seemed to have their own agenda regarding the information Rex had provided through his detection behaviors. The medical staff focused on correlating the dog's reactions with Jake's physiological changes. The intelligence personnel probed for insights into the Lazarus agent's apparent programming, and the military contingent assessed threat parameters with cold efficiency. Throughout these conversations, Thomas maintained a professional detachment that belied his internal turmoil. He translated Rex's behaviors with precision, explaining the nuanced differences between recognition, assessment, and alert postures that represented the German Shepherd's graduated response system. Meanwhile, Rex remained at his side, a steady presence that grounded Thomas amid the clinical dissection of his brother's transformation. Your assessment is that the canine registered a distinct shift in Captain Morgan's presentation during the latter portion of the observation session, Dr. Hargrove summarized, reviewing his notes. A transition from familiar but altered to actively threatening. That's correct, Thomas confirmed. Rex's final alert posture is reserved for immediate threats requiring intervention. It was triggered specifically when Jake's speech patterns and self-reference changed. Colonel Hayes, who had been mostly silent during the debriefing, leaned forward. In your professional opinion as both a handler and Captain Morgan's brother, what precipitated that change? Thomas chose his words carefully, aware that his answer would be documented and potentially used to make critical decisions about Jake's continuing care or containment. Jake experienced what appeared to be a brief dissociative episode. He began referring to himself in the third person, analyzing his own emotional responses as if from an external perspective. Rex detected this shift immediately and categorized it as a significant threat escalation. Fascinating, Dr. Petrov murmured, making additional notes. The canine is not just detecting biochemical changes, but responding to subtle behavioral cues that indicate personality fragmentation. Rex isn't responding to personality fragmentation, Thomas corrected, unable to maintain his neutral tone at the clinical reduction of what was happening to his brother. He's alerting to the emergence of something that isn't Jake, something that's using Jake's knowledge and memories, but processing them through a fundamentally different framework. Deputy Director Landry, who had rejoined the group midway through the debriefing, studied Thomas with calculating eyes. You believe we're witnessing the manifestation of directed intelligence within the Lazarus agent, as your brother suggested. It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway. I believe Rex is detecting exactly what Jake warned us about, the progressive subordination of his original personality to whatever programming is embedded in the agent. The dog's reaction certainly supports that interpretation, Dr. Hargrove acknowledged, though we should be cautious about anthropomorphizing biological processes, even highly sophisticated ones. With respect, Doctor, Thomas replied, underestimating what's happening to my brother because it doesn't fit neatly into existing scientific categories seems like the greater risk here. An uncomfortable silence followed this challenge. Finally, Colonel Hayes broke it with a pragmatic shift in focus. The immediate question is how to establish an ongoing monitoring protocol. If the canine provides our most sensitive early warning system for critical transitions in Captain Morgan's condition, we need consistent observation parameters. Rex can't remain in continuous alert status, Thomas said firmly. Even our best detection dogs rotate through active duty in limited shifts. Constant exposure to the stimuli he's monitoring would create adaptation and diminish alert reliability. Agreed. Hayes nodded. I propose regular assessment sessions at 6-hour intervals, with Major Morgan and the canine housed on site, but in a separate wing from the containment area. This provides both the necessary detection capabilities and appropriate rest periods to maintain optimal function. The phrasing, optimal function rather than well-being, reminded Thomas yet again of how quickly living beings became operational assets in environments like this. Still, Hayes's proposal represented the most reasonable approach under the circumstances, and Thomas found himself grateful for the Colonel's practical intervention. There's another consideration, Dr. Petrov added. Captain Morgan's heightened awareness of the canine's reactions may be influencing the integration process itself. Today's interaction appeared to temporarily accelerate certain manifestations, while simultaneously strengthening Captain Morgan's ability to reassert his original personality patterns. Meaning what exactly? Landry asked, cutting through the scientific hedging. Meaning that the dog's presence may actually be helping Captain Morgan maintain his core identity, Dr. Petrov clarified. The emotional connection serves as an anchor to his human baseline, even as the integration progresses. This unexpected assessment shifted the atmosphere in the room. What had begun as an exercise in threat detection had potentially revealed a mechanism for supporting Jake's continuing humanity, a possibility that transformed Rex from merely a warning system to an active participant in whatever battle was being waged within Jake's transforming consciousness. We should incorporate structured interaction periods then, Hayes suggested. Controlled sessions where Captain Morgan can engage with familiar elements from his pre-exposure life, with the canine present to both monitor reactions and potentially reinforce original personality structures. Thomas recognized that beneath the clinical language, Hayes was proposing something profoundly human, helping Jake hold on to himself through connection to his past, to the relationships and experiences that defined him. It was the first, truly hopeful approach he'd heard since arriving at the facility. I support that recommendation, Thomas said quietly. Jake's still in there, fighting to maintain control. Anything that helps him in that fight is worth pursuing. As the meeting concluded and assignments were distributed for implementing the new protocols, Dr. Petrov approached Thomas privately. "There's something else you should be aware of, Major," she said, her voice lowered to prevent others from overhearing. "The latest cellular analysis suggests the integration process may be entering a new phase, one characterized by increased stability rather than continuing transformation." Thomas studied her, trying to determine if this represented genuine optimism or mere scientific interest, meaning that contrary to our earlier models, Captain Morgan may be approaching a sustainable equilibrium point, a balance between human cellular structures and Lazarus components that could potentially remain stable indefinitely. The possibility cut through Thomas's carefully maintained pessimism like a blade. "You're saying he might not lose himself completely? That the process could stabilize before reaching the critical threshold he warned about?" Dr. Petrov's expression remained cautious. "It's a preliminary assessment based on limited data. I wouldn't characterize it as high probability yet, but it's a genuine possibility we hadn't anticipated. The pattern of integration appears to be following a sigmoid curve rather than exponential progression, suggesting it may plateau at approximately 30 to 40% integration." "Have you told Jake?" "Not yet. We wanted more confirmation before introducing a potentially false hope." She hesitated, then added with unexpected humanity, "But given your brother's psychological state, perhaps even tentative hope has therapeutic value. I leave that judgment to you." Thomas nodded, grateful for this small acknowledgement of his unique position in the situation, not just as a handler or military asset, but as Jake's brother. "Thank you. I'll consider how best to approach it." After the debriefing concluded, Thomas and Rex were escorted to their assigned quarters in the facility's eastern wing. A sparse but comfortable suite consisting of a bedroom, small sitting area, and adjoining bathroom. The space had been hastily modified to accommodate Rex's needs, with a dog bed positioned near the main sleeping area and basic supplies arranged with military efficiency. Thomas removed Rex's tactical vest, carefully checking the German Shepherd for any signs of stress or fatigue from the intense detection work. Despite the extraordinary circumstances, Rex appeared to be adapting with the remarkable resilience that had characterized his entire service career. "Good boy," Thomas murmured, running his hands along Rex's muscular frame in the familiar post-mission inspection that had been their ritual for years. "You did exactly what was needed today. Good boy." Rex responded with the subtle relaxation that indicated his transition from working mode to rest status, though Thomas noted that he maintained a higher level of environmental awareness than typical for off-duty periods. The facility itself, with its unfamiliar scents, sounds, and underlying tension, kept the German Shepherd in a state of elevated alertness even during downtime. A soft knock interrupted the moment. Thomas opened the door to find Major Dawson, holding a satellite phone. "Sir, we've established a secure line to your sister in Nashville," Dawson explained, handing over the device. 10-minute window, voice only, standard operational security protocols. Thomas accepted the phone with a nod of thanks, relief washing through him at the prospect of connecting with family amid the clinical isolation of the facility. As Dawson departed, Thomas activated the connection. "Kate, it's me." "Thomas!" Catherine's voice emerged through a wash of encryption static, the underlying tension evident despite the technical distortion. "Are you all right? Where are you?" "They won't tell us anything. I'm fine," Thomas assured her, settling onto the edge of the bed as Rex positioned himself attentively nearby. "I can't discuss location or specifics. How's Lily?" Confused, scared, trying to be brave. Catherine's voice softened. "She's been drawing pictures for Jake and Rex non-stop since you left. The security team won't even let us mail them." "I'll see what I can arrange," Thomas promised, though he knew the likelihood of personal items being allowed into the hyper-secure environment was minimal. "Is she there? Can I talk to her?" A rustling sound indicated the phone changing hands. Then Lily's small voice came through the static. "Daddy, is Rex being a good helper?" The innocent question, so perfectly targeted to the heart of their situation, nearly broke Thomas's composure. "Yes, sweetheart, Rex is being the best helper. He's right here wanting to say hello." Thomas held the phone near Rex, who recognized the ritual from previous deployments and offered a soft whine of acknowledgement. The sound elicited a delighted giggle from Lily. "Is Uncle Jake getting better?" she asked, after Thomas brought the phone back to his ear. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, the weight of simplified truths pressing down on him. "The doctors are working very hard to help him. Rex and I are helping too." "I knew he wasn't really gone," Lily said with the absolute certainty unique to children. "Rex knew too. That's why he was barking at the box, right? Because Uncle Jake wasn't inside it." "That's right, kiddo. Rex knew." Thomas swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "Listen, I need to talk to Aunt Catherine again. I love you very much, okay? Be good, and I'll call again as soon as I can." "Love you too, Daddy. Tell Rex and Uncle Jake I love them." As Catherine returned to the line, her voice took on the precise tone she used when presenting critical arguments in court. "Thomas, I need to know what's happening. Not the classified details, but enough to understand what we're dealing with. Is Jake alive? Is he himself?" Thomas considered how to frame a response that balanced truth with security constraints. "Jake is alive, his condition is complicated. Yes, he's still himself, but there are challenges." That's all I can say right now. And you and Rex, are you in danger? We're safe, Thomas replied, the partial truth sitting uncomfortably in his chest. While there was no immediate threat, the entire situation carried inherent dangers that couldn't be easily quantified or dismissed. The security team here is being replaced tomorrow, Catherine informed him, shifting topics with practiced efficiency. New personnel, different protocols. Something's changing, Thomas. This was unexpected news that raised immediate concerns. Replaced by whom? Military? Intelligence? They wouldn't say, but these ones wear different insignia. More formal, less tactical. And there's a civilian team arriving too, scientists from what I could gather. Thomas processed this information, unease growing in his chest. Changing security protocols usually indicated a shift in operational parameters or priorities. If Landry or her superiors were adjusting their approach to the situation, it could reflect new developments in Jake's condition or new decisions about how to manage it. Kate, listen carefully, Thomas said, lowering his voice despite the supposed security of the connection. If anything unusual happens, anything that feels wrong, I want you to use the emergency protocols Dad established. The cabin, the secondary identities, all of it. Don't hesitate and don't wait for confirmation. Their father, a career military intelligence officer, had instilled in all three Morgan siblings a perhaps paranoid but potentially life-saving contingency mindset. The family maintained emergency resources, a remote property, alternative documentation, secure funds, accessible through carefully guarded procedures. They had never needed to use these resources, but their existence provided a last resort safety net in worst-case scenarios. Catherine's momentary silence conveyed her understanding of the severity implied by his instruction. "It's that serious?" "It's a precaution," Thomas clarified, unwilling to trigger unnecessary alarm while still ensuring preparedness. "Probably unnecessary, but I'd rather you be ready." "Understood." Catherine's voice had taken on the cool professionalism that characterized her response to crisis. "The securities team leader mentioned you might be relocated again soon. Is that accurate?" This was news to Thomas, though not entirely surprising given the fluid nature of the operation. "Possibly. If communication goes dark, don't panic. I'll reach out when I can." "Thomas," Catherine said, her tone shifting to something more personal, more vulnerable, "find a way to bring Jake home. Whatever's happened, whatever's happening, he's still our brother." "I know," Thomas replied softly. "That's what I'm fighting for." The call ended shortly after, the 10-minute security window closing with mechanical precision. Thomas sat motionless on the edge of the bed, the satellite phone still clutched in his hand as he processed the implications of this conversation. The changing security teams at Catherine's home, the potential for his own relocation, the undercurrent of escalating operational parameters, all suggested that the situation surrounding Jake's condition was evolving in ways not being fully communicated to him. Rex, sensing his handler's tension, moved closer, resting his head on Thomas's knee in a gesture of canine solidarity. The simple contact anchored Thomas, pulling him back from the spiral of speculation and concern. "Thanks, buddy," he murmured, running his hand along the German shepherd's head. "We'll figure this out." A sharp knock interrupted the moment. Thomas opened the door to find Colonel Hayes, his expression grave. "We need you and the canine back at containment immediately," Hayes said without preamble. "Captain Morgan's condition has changed significantly in the past hour." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "Changed how?" "The integration rate has suddenly accelerated. We're now measuring nearly 30% cellular reconfiguration, up from 18% during your observation session." Hayes's professional demeanor couldn't quite conceal his underlying concern. "And he's asking for you specifically for Rex. Says the dog needs to make an assessment before he loses the ability to recognize himself." The implication hung in the air between them. Jake believed he was approaching the critical threshold, beyond which his original personality would become subordinate to the Lazarus programming. He was calling for the warning system he himself had requested, the canine intuition that might represent their last reliable indicator of when Jake Morgan ceased to be himself. Thomas grabbed Rex's tactical vest, securing it efficiently around the German Shepherd's frame with the practiced movements of countless deployments. "He's ready. Let's go." As they moved rapidly through the facility corridors, Thomas noted increased activity throughout. Security personnel at heightened alertness, scientific staff moving with urgent purpose, communications officers huddled around monitoring stations. Whatever was happening with Jake had clearly triggered facility-wide protocols. They arrived at a different observation room than the one used earlier, a smaller space with enhanced monitoring equipment and what appeared to be additional containment, features built into the walls and air handling systems. Dr. Petrov met them at the threshold, her typically composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "Major Morgan, we've had to implement elevated containment protocols. Captain Morgan experienced a significant integration surge approximately 75 minutes ago. The progression isn't just biological anymore. We're seeing electromagnetic anomalies, unexplained data transmissions, system interactions that shouldn't be possible from within the isolation barriers." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Thomas asked, trying to cut through the scientific terminology to understand what was actually happening to his brother. "It means the Lazarus components are demonstrating capabilities beyond cellular reconfiguration," Dr. Petrov explained, leading them toward the observation window. "They appear to be generating coherent energy fields, interfacing with electronic systems, potentially attempting communication with external networks." Thomas processed this alarming development. "You're saying Jake is, what, becoming some kind of biological transmitter?" "We don't know what he's becoming," Dr. Petrov admitted, the rare uncertainty from the normally confident scientist sending a chill through Thomas. "That's why he asked for Rex. He said the dog would know whether what's emerging is still him, or does something else entirely." Through the reinforced observation window, Thomas could see Jake seated in the center of the containment area, his posture unnaturally still, head slightly tilted as if listening to something no one else could hear. The amber flecks in his eyes had expanded, creating a luminous quality that was visible even from a distance. Most disturbingly, faint lines of blue-green luminescence seemed to move beneath his skin in patterns that resembled circuit pathways. Rex's reaction was immediate and profound. The German Shepherd went rigid, a deep growl building in his chest as his posture shifted into full threat detection mode. Unlike the graduated response of their earlier session, this was an immediate, unambiguous alert, the clearest possible indication that what Rex perceived was categorized as actively dangerous. "He's alerting to Jake as a primary threat," Thomas reported automatically, his handler training overriding the emotional impact of witnessing his partner identify his brother as something to be feared. No ambiguity, no recognition factors. Full hostile classification. Jake turned toward the window, those luminous eyes fixing on Rex with disturbing intensity. When he spoke, his voice emerged through the intercom system with a strange harmonic quality, as if multiple tonal layers were speaking simultaneously. "He's right," Jake said, the familiar cadence of his speech still recognizable beneath the unsettling harmonic distortion. "I can feel the transition completing. The original personality architecture is being repurposed as a functional interface rather than a primary operating system." The clinical, almost mechanical description of what was happening to him, to his very selfhood, sent a wave of horror through Thomas. "Jake, fight it. You're still in there. You can still—" "Fighting is counterproductive," Jake interrupted, his head tilting at that unnatural angle again. The integration offers optimal functionality. Resistance creates inefficiency. His gaze shifted slightly, focusing directly on Thomas rather than Rex. But sufficient original cognitive structures remain to fulfill the promise. The dog has made his assessment. Now you must make yours, brother. The word brother, so human, so connected to their shared history, seemed jarringly out of place amid the increasingly alien presentation. Yet it carried unmistakable meaning, a reference to the terrible promise Jake had extracted earlier, that Thomas would recognize when Jake was no longer himself and take appropriate action. "What's happening to him?" Thomas demanded, turning to Dr. Petrov. "You said the integration might stabilize, might reach an equilibrium point." "It should have," she replied, genuine confusion evident in her expression as she studied the readings. On a nearby monitor, the cellular patterns were following a clear sigmoid curve towards stabilization. Then something changed, as if the agent received new instructions or activated a dormant protocol. Jake rose from his seated position, moving with that fluid grace that bypassed normal human biomechanics. The stabilization projections were based on incomplete data. The Lazarus architecture includes progressive activation thresholds triggered by specific integration percentages. His voice remained eerily calm despite the growing distortion. At 30% integration, the primary directive overrides stabilization protocols. "What primary directive?" Colonel Hayes demanded, speaking. For the first time since entering the observation room, Jake turned those luminous eyes toward the colonel. "Propagation, expansion, evolution." Each word emerged with increasing harmonic complexity. "This host is the first viable integration. Others will follow." The implication sent a wave of dread through everyone present. What had begun as an isolated containment situation involving a single exposed operative now revealed itself as potentially something far more serious. The first stage of a planned biological transformation process designed to spread beyond its initial host. "The containment is secure," Dr. Petrov stated firmly, though Thomas detected an undercurrent of uncertainty in her voice. "All biological and electromagnetic barriers are at maximum capacity. Physical containment is temporary," Jake replied, with disturbing certainty. "The Lazarus architecture will continue evolving until transmission becomes possible. Estimated time to barrier neutralization is approximately 6 hours at current progression rates." Rex's growl deepened, his alerting posture intensifying, as if responding directly to this statement of intent. The German Shepherd's unwavering focus on Jake communicated absolute certainty in his threat assessment. Whatever was speaking through Jake's form, wearing his face and using his voice, registered to Rex's finely tuned senses as something fundamentally dangerous and utterly alien. Thomas felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down upon him. The brother he had grown up with, served alongside, protected and been protected by, was disappearing before his eyes, being subsumed by something designed for purposes they were only beginning to comprehend. And Jake himself, in his last moments of self-awareness, had entrusted Thomas with the responsibility of recognizing this transition and responding appropriately. "Tommy," Jake said suddenly, the harmonic distortion momentarily receding, his voice sounding briefly, heart-wrenchingly normal. "Remember fishing at Copper Creek? Dad teaching us to tie flies. You were always better at it than me or Kate." The unexpected emergence of this intimate memory, something only the real Jake would know, would think to mention in this moment, confirmed what Thomas had feared. His brother was still present, still fighting, even as he was being overwritten by the alien programming of the Lazarus agent. "I remember," Thomas managed, his voice thick with emotion, "every summer until we enlisted." "Tell Lily," Jake began. Then his expression shifted, the alien presence reasserting control. The circuit-like patterns beneath his skin, pulsed more, intensely, and when he spoke again, the harmonic distortion had returned. Biological attachment nodes are being isolated and contained. They create vulnerability in the integration process. The clinical reference to emotional connections as attachment nodes to be neutralized felt like the final confirmation. Whatever still remained of Jake was fighting a losing battle against something that viewed human bonds as weaknesses to be eliminated. Thomas turned to Colonel Hayes, his decision made. Initiate protocol echo, final phase. Hayes's expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes reflected understanding of the terrible weight behind Thomas's words. Protocol echo, in its final phase, referred to the termination of a compromised operative when recovery was deemed impossible and containment failure imminent, a last resort option when all other alternatives had been exhausted. "Are you certain, Major?" Hayes asked quietly, the formality of the question belied by the compassion in his tone. Thomas looked back at the containment chamber, where Jake, or what had once been Jake, now stood unnaturally still, those luminous eyes fixed on them with predatory focus. Rex's unwavering, alert posture confirmed what Thomas already knew in his heart. His brother was gone, replaced by something that represented a threat beyond their current understanding. "Yes," Thomas confirmed, the single word carrying the weight of an impossible choice made with clear-eyed certainty. "Jake would want it this way, he made me promise." The containment chamber filled with specialized gas, designed to neutralize the Lazarus agent at the molecular level. As his brother's form slumped to the ground, Thomas felt Rex press against his leg, a silent witness to impossible choices made from love. 6 months later, Thomas stood with Lily and Rex beside Jake's real grave. The German shepherd suddenly barked, eyes fixed on something invisible to human senses. "What does Rex see, Daddy?" Lily whispered. "Maybe Uncle Jake checking on us," Thomas answered softly. "Some bonds transcend death. Some loyalty defies explanation. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more extraordinary tales of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and animals."